Ladies and gentlemen, that was an electrifying and fun match. The motion once more. This house believes that managers should be held more responsible for occupational outcomes than senior policymakers in the public sector. So this motion was actually a very interesting motion, and the motion actually is kind of sneaky because while the motion seems pretty straightforward, there is a subtlety in the motion that provides a bit of nuance. See, the motion doesn't say who is more responsible. The motion asks who should be held more responsible. And so what that does is it opens up a different line of analysis. The motion goes bit beyond who is responsible, that is, who is objectively the person who should be held responsible, but it also accommodates the idea of who ought to be more responsible. And these might not always be the same person. See, who is more responsible doesn't necessarily have to be the person who we should put more responsibility on, because other than the objective yes or no, there are a lot of other analysis as to why we should hold another party responsible. And to the joy of the judges, those peripheral analysis did in fact come out in the debate, right? So what did we get from this match? Well, we got a setup from Cornwall College, from the first speaker, Tech One, that, well, quite frankly, managers should be the ones who have the most responsibility because they have the most control. Yes, they are the one who are the first point of contact. And in fact, the problem isn't the policy, which would put the is analysis on the policymaker. The problem is the execution, which would put the is part of the question of responsibility on the manager. Tekon Ellis tells us. They tell us that they are the people who see what happens in the workplace. They tell us about OSHA and how OSHA came about because of a complete violation of occupational health standards. And it was just really a really bad outcome. And that with the implementation of OSHA, what that does is, though it was a policy, empower the managers within the workplace to ensure that they are doing particular things. It comes with penalties and it comes with consequences. And then we get this really interesting model at the end of Tequan's speech as to how it is that we're going to actually go about doing this. Now, we take that analysis and we weigh it against Shantae's analysis from Montego Bay High School. See, Shantae tells us that, well, quite frankly, yes, Shantae tells us quite frankly that, well, it is a structural situation. Shantae tells us that if it walks like a dog and barks like a dog, it is a dog. If it is that there is widespread structural inefficiencies, if it is that nurses are burnt out across the island, if it is that schools are overburdened across the island, if it is that there's equipment shortages across the island, then it doesn't make logical sense for the problem to be the managers. It only makes sense for the problem to be higher level, a higher order analysis. Shantae tells us that responsibility must follow design. She tells us that inasmuch as it is an institutional problem, the logical outcome of that analysis is that it's not the manager's fault. The judges agree. The judges agree that the reason why there is such widespread failure in our public sector, why people are burnt out and why we lack the infrastructure, is not because of the managers. We agree with you on that end, dear Shantae. Now, the question then becomes, why? See, Shantae tells us it's not the managers. The judges agree with her. Shantae then goes on to tell us that it's the policymaker. That now the judges were a little bit unsure about, especially in light of Andrew Cammock's analysis from Cornwall College that, quite frankly, policymakers can't pull money out of thin air. See, Team Montego Bay High School for Girls tells us that the fault lies with the policymakers because they're in control of the budget, they're in control of how the money gets allocated, and therefore the responsibility must lie with them. Team Cornwall College explains that these policymakers, permanent secretaries, elected officials, and such, exist within the constraints of existing fiscal budgets, and there's nothing that they can do to get more money. Now we get this analysis of increasing tax through sweets and all of that. And sure, that is valid. It can be raised, but it doesn't change the principal outlying question of the fact that the policymakers are constrained by a budget. In as much as we'll have to raise taxes in order to get more funding, we all know how Jamaicans feel about an increase in taxes, and we all know that's not necessarily something that we want to be doing intuitively. So then, here is what the judges really matched it out as. The Montego Bay High School for Girls foists it upon the policymakers and says, you have the capacity to fix these problems because you have access to the budget, you have access to the money. And they put a lot of responsibility on them. Cornwall College completely removes that responsibility from the policymakers and say they can't make money out of thin air, there's nothing that they can do. So here we have a juxtaposition where one team is foisting immense responsibility on the policymakers to find the money, and another team is denying that responsibility. This is how the judges think. We think that there was too much foisting upon the policymakers, and we think Cornwall, you really didn't appreciate that policymakers fundamentally have more influence in addressing the budget than a manager, right? In as much as the policymaker sits atop, has the ear of the minister, has the ear of whomever, they can probably do a little bit more to get access to money than the manager, but that still doesn't change the fact that their capacity is significantly restrained. And so that idea and argument still stands, even though we think that a bit of a concession would have definitely helped you there. But the idea still stands. So that's how the first half of the debate weighed out. Now we get this idea of who ought to bear the responsibility, right? And in as much as we think who is the person to bear the responsibility, it's all but tied. A big part of the debate, in terms of the winning team, is who ought to bear the responsibility. See, one team tells us that the problem with putting the responsibility on the senior manager is that it makes them a scapegoat. In as much as we foist that responsibility on the senior manager, the people who actually has the power, as Shantae tells us, responsibility follows power. The person who actually has the power, the senior policymaker, is insulated, and that's bad. We think that's really interesting. We got that idea to a great extent coming out of the second speaker from Montego Bay High School for Girls, Renee. Renee, we wanted to hear a lot more about that. It's a really interesting idea. Yes? Why is it bad that we make the managers scapegoats? Why does that lead to particular outcomes? What's the impact of that? Give me some more warranting about that. It's an interesting claim, but we want to hear a lot more of that. That's a really interesting idea. We weigh that analysis against Cornwall's analysis of what it ought to be in the manager, in as much as the manager who exists within the constraints of the society, in constraints of the budget, that the policymaker doesn't have that much power to do, that the manager can kind of make things a little better. They can spot the violations quicker. They can help to address them better. They can help with burnout better. They can schedule better. They can talk a little bit better. And they can engender a rich culture better. Ladies and gentlemen, when we weigh the analysis of who is more responsible and who ought to be held more responsible, along with the other issues that came out in this debate, the judges would have come to a final decision. One team on 271 points, to the other teams winning 275 points. The team that will win this match and automatically advance to the semi-finals of this competition is the team in proposition Cornwall College.
Well,
Good job. Good job. Congratulations.
thank you so much, Mabe. And congratulations to you guys. It was a wonderful case. Honestly, it was a great case, a mind-boggling case. We were sitting down here for while the adjudicators were gone, and we were just mind-boggled by the case. Honestly, we're so glad we pushed off the match so that we could have it today, just so that we could have such an intense game today. Thank you.
Thank you. We should thank you.
All right. Thank you very much indeed. And so, ladies and gentlemen, your winners for this match, Cornwall College. In terms of the best debater from this match, the judges couldn't differentiate between the two. We have in this match two best debaters, one from either team. And so from Cornwall College, we have the first speaker, Tequan Ellis. And from the Montego Bay High School for Girls, tying on the same points, we have their first speaker, Shantae Lawrence. Ladies and gentlemen, with that said, we conclude the quarterfinals of the Jamaica Civil Service Association High School Debate Competition for 2025. Join us next week. We will have the semi-final rounds concluding this debate competition. Prior to that, rather after that, will be the grand finals and third place playoffs, which will be held at JCSA Park. The details to follow soon. Until then, ladies and gentlemen, it has been my pleasure to host this debate. Have a wonderful rest of your day.